Okay, a very good evening, everyone. Um, Tonight we will be reading some more H.P. Lovecraft stories. A pretty good one tonight as well. The Rats in the Walls is a relatively well-known story, I think. Uh, it's pretty good. Also, the Hound. I'm not sure. I can't remember it, so I don't know if it's good or not. We'll find out. Um, I'm happy today because tomorrow the gyms in the Netherlands will be reopening again. And I will finally be able to lift again, which is great. Let's get into it. I hope you didn't just hear the motor outside. Okay. Let's go. In my tortured ears, there sounds unceasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping, and a faint distant baying as of some gigantic hound. It is not dream, it is not, I fear, even madness, for too much has already happened to give me these merciful doubts. Saint John is a mangled corpse. I alone know why, and such is my knowledge that I am about to blow out my brains for fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down unlit and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweeps the black, shapeless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate, wearied with the commonplaces of a prosaic world, where even the joys of romance and adventure soon grow stale. Saint John and I had followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas, the enigmas of the symbolist and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites, all were ours in that time, but each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadence could help us, and this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of frills, till finally there remained for us only the more direct stimuli of unnatural personal experiences and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable course which, even in my present fear, I mention with shame and timidity, that hideous extremity of human outrage, the abhorrent practice of grave robbing. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions, or catalogue even partly the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt, alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place, where with the satanic taste of neurotic virtuosi we had assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room, far, far underground, where huge winged demons carven of basalt and onyx vomited from white grinning mouths weird green and orange light. And hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death the lines of red charnel things, hand in the hand woven in voluminous black hangings. Through these pipes came at will the odors or moods sometimes most craved. Sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies, sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined eastern shrines of the kingly dead, and sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful, soul-upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies, alternating with comely lifelike bodies, perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art. And with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world, niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There on one might there one might find the rotting bald pates of famous noblemen, and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new buried children. Statues and paintings there were, all of fiendish subjects and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio, bound in tanned human skin, held certain unknown and unnameable drawings, which it was rumored Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed, brass and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and cacodemoniacal ghastliness. Whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tomb loot ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot in particular that I must not speak. Thank God, I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar ghouls, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, and environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of aesthetic expression, and we gave their details a fastidious technical care. An inappropriate hour, a jarring lighting effect, or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that aesthetic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous, grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for novel scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiable. St. John was always the leader, and he it was who led the way at last to that mocking and accursed spot which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible Holland churchyard? Hey, Holland! I think it was the dark rumor and legendary, the tale of one buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scene in these final moments. The pale autumnal moon over the graves, casting long horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass and the crumbling slabs. The vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon. The antique ivy church pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky. The phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in the distant corner. The odors of mold, vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamps and seas. And, worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard this suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry, for he whom we sought had centuries before been found in the selfsame spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remember how we delved in the ghoul's grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange half-heard, directionless baying of some objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than the damp mold, and beheld the rotting oblong box, crusted with mineral deposits from the long undisturbed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean, white skull and its long, firm teeth, and its eyeless sockets that once had glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was the oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching winged hound, or a sphinx with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from a small piece of jade. The expression of its features was repellent in the extreme, savoring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither St. John nor I could identify. And on the bottom, like a maker's seal, was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it, that this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it. But as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as a thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul el-Harazad, the ghastly sole symbol of the corpse-eating Kaldov. Inaccessible Leng in Central Asia. All too well did we trace the sinister lineaments described by the old Arab demonologist, lineaments he wrote, drawn from some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave at last glance at the bleached and carven-eyed face of its owner, and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened from the abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we could not be sure. So too as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home. We thought we heard the faint, distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background, but the autumn wind moaned sad and wan, and we could not be sure. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone and without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequented moot, so that our door was seldom disturbed by the knock of a visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be a frequent fumbling in the night, not only around the doors, but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large, opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it, and another time we thought we heard a whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion investigation revealed nothing, and we began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination, which still prolonged in our ears the faint far baying we thought we had heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burnt a strangely scented candle before it. We read much in el-Harazad's Necronomicon and its properties, and about the relation of ghost souls and to objects it symbolized, and were disturbed by what we read. Then the terror came. On the night of September 24, I heard a knock at my chamber door, fancying it St. John's. I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor when I aroused St. John from his sleep. He professed entire ignorance of the event, and became as worried as I. It was the night that the faint, distant baying over the moor became to us a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we had always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an unaccountable rush of air and heard, as if receding far away, a queer combination of rustling, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to determine. We only realized, with the blackest of apprehensions, that the apparent disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After we lived in a growing horror and fascination, most we held to the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements, but sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess, and every night that demoniac baying rolled over the wind-swept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29, we found in the soft earth underneath the library window a series of footprints utterly impossible to describe. They were as baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination on November 18th, when St. John, walking home after dark from the dismal railroad station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and see a vague, black, cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper, "The amulet! That damned thing!" Then he collapsed, in an inert mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens, and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life. And as I pronounced the last demoniac sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it. And when I saw on the dim-lighted moor a white nebulous shadow sweeping from the mount to mount, I shut my eyes and threw myself face down upon the ground. When I arose trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisance before the enshrined amulet of green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights, I heard the baying again, and before a week was over, felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind, stronger than the night wind, brushed by, and I knew what had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning the thing to its silent, sleeping owner I knew not, but I felt that I must try and any step conceivably logical. What the hound was, and why it had pursued me, were questions still vague. But I had first heard the baying in that ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying, whisper had served to connect the curse with the stealing of the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the nethermost abysses of despair when at an inn in Rotterdam I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of its sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of a nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenant had fallen a red death, beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighborhood. In a squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace, and those around had heard all night a faint, deep, insistent note as of a gigantic hound. So at last I stood again in the unwholesome churchyard where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows, and leafless trees drooped sullenly to meet the withered, frosty grass and cracking slabs, and the ivied church pointed a jeering finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated, and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats which had been hovering cautiously overhead. I know not why I went thither unless to pray, or gibber out insane pleas and apologies to the calm white thing that lay within. But whatever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of a dominating will outside myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption, when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave dirt until I killed him with a blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. For crouching within the centuried coffin, embraced by a close-packed nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed. Not clean and placid as we had seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me with phosphorescent sockets and sharp and sanguine fangs, yawning twistedly in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep sardonic bay, as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claw the lost and faithful amulet of green jade, I merely screamed and ran away idiotically. My screams soon dissolved into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness rides the star wind. Claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses. Dripping death astride a bacchanala of bats from night-black ruins of buried temples of Belial. Now, as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed web-winged circles closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable. Okay, that was The Hound. Yeah, it's a pretty good story. Like, the recursion is nice. It really adds to the story. He constantly keeps referring to the baying of the gigantic hound. This really helps the story, I would say. But other than that, the creature is basically a vampire. It needs to be let in. It laughs when it's let in. Also, it's set in Holland. That's kind of funny. Um, However, I do want to make one point of note. It's quite clear that H.P. Lovecraft is American because there are no vultures in Holland anywhere. So if the vulture actually appeared, that would have been strange for Holland. Like impossible, basically. I'm gonna take a quick break to drink some drinks, and then I'll be back. And I'm back. The next story is called The Rats in the Walls. Yeah, like I said previously, I think it's a relatively more well-known story of H.P. Lovecraft. It's definitely a good one. Um, yeah, let's get into it. On July 16th, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labors. The restoration had been a stupendous task, for little had remained of the deserted pile but a shell-like ruin. Yet because it had been the seat of my ancestors, I let no expense deter me. The place had not been inhabited since the reign of James I, when the tragedy of intensely hideous and, though largely unexplained, nature had struck down the master, 5 of his children, and several servants, and driven forth under a cloud of suspicion and terror the third son, my lineal progenitor, and the only survivor of the abhorred line. With this sole heir denounced as a murderer, the estate had reverted to the crown. Nor had the accursed man made any attempt to exculpate himself or regain his property. Shaken by some horror greater than that of conscience or the law, and expressing only a frantic wish to exclude the ancient edifice from his sight and memory, Walter de la Poer, 11th Baron Exham, fled to Virginia, and there founded a family which by the next century had become known as Delapoer. Exham Priory had remained though untenanted, though later allotted to the estates of the Norris family and much studied because of its peculiarly composite architecture. An architecture involving Gothic towers resting on a Saxon or Romanesque substructure, whose foundations in turn was of a still earlier order or blend of orders, Roman and even Druidic or native Cimmeric, if legends speak truly. This foundation was a very singular thing, being merged on one side with the solid limestone of the precipice, from whose brink the priory overlooked a desolate valley 3 miles west of the village of Ancaster. Architects and antiquarians loved to examine this strange relic of forgotten centuries, but the country folk hated it. They had hated it hundreds of years before, when my ancestors lived there, and they hated it now with the most and with moss and mold of abandonment on it. I had not been a day in Ancaster before I knew I came of an accursed house, and this week workmen have blown up Exon Priory, and are busy obliterating the traces of its foundation. The bare statistics of my ancestry I had always known, together with the fact that my American forebearer had come to the colonies under a strange cloud of details. However, I had been kept wholly ignorant through the policy of reticence always maintained by the Delapores. Unlike all planter neighbors, we seldom boasted of crusading ancestors or other medieval and Renaissance heroes. Nor was any kind of tradition handed down except what may have been recorded in the sealed envelope left before the Civil War, by every squire to his eldest son for posthumous opening. The glories we cherished were those achieved since the migration, the glories of a proud and honorable, if somewhat reserved and unsocial Virginia line. During the war our fortunes were extinguished, and our whole existence changed by the burning of Carfax, our home on the banks of the James. My grandfather, advanced in years, had perished in the incendiary outrage, and with him the envelope that had bound us all to the past. I can recall that fire today as I saw it then at the age of 7, with the Federal soldiers shouting, the women screaming, and the Negroes howling and praying. My father was in the army, defending Richmond, and after many formalities my mother and I were passed through the lines to join him. When the war ended we all moved north, whence my mother had come, and I grew to manhood, middle age, and ultimate wealth as a stolid Yankee. Neither my father nor I ever knew what our hereditary envelope had contained, and as I merged into the greyness of Massachusetts business life, I lost all interest in the mysteries which evidently lurked far back in my family tree. Had I suspected their nature, how gladly I would have left Exon Priory to its moss, bats, and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, but without any message to leave to me, or to my only child, Alfred, a motherless boy of 10. It was this boy who reversed the order of family information, for although I could give him only jesting conjectures about the past, he wrote me of some very interesting ancestral legends when the late war took him to England in 1917 as an aviation officer. Apparently the Delapores had a colorful and perhaps sinister history for a friend of my son's. Captain Edward Norris of the Royal Flying Corps, dwelt near the family seat at Ancaster, and related some peasant superstitions which few novelists could equal for wildness and incredibility. Norris himself, of course, did not take them so seriously, but they amused my son and made good material for his letters to me. It was this legendary which definitely turned my attention to my transatlantic heritage, and made me resolve to purchase and restore the family seat which Norris showed to Alfred in its picturesque desertion, and offered to get for him at a surprisingly reasonable figure, since his own uncle was the present owner. I bought Exon Priory in 1918, but was almost immediately distracted from my plans of restoration by the return of my son as a maimed invalid. During the 2 years that he lived, I thought of nothing but his care, and having even placed my business under the direction of my partners. In 1921, as I found myself bereaved and aimless, a retired manufacturer no longer young, I resolved to divert my remaining years with my new possession. Visiting Ancaster in December, I was entertained by Captain Norris, a plump, amiable young man who had thought much of my son, and secured his assistance in gathering plans and anecdotes to guide the coming restoration. Exon Priory itself I saw without emotion, a jumble of tottering medieval ruins, covered with lichens and honeycombed with rooks' nests, perched perilously upon a precipice, and denuded of floors or other interior features, save the stone walls of the separate towers. As I gradually recovered the image of the edifice as it had been when my ancestors left it over 3 centuries before, I began to hire workmen for the reconstruction. In every case, I was forced to go outside the immediate locality, for the Ancaster villagers had an almost unbelievable fear and hatred of the place. This sentiment was so great that it was sometimes communicated to the outside laborers, causing numerous desertions, whilst its scope appeared to include both the priory and its ancient family. My son had told me that he was somewhat avoided during his visits because he was a Delapour, and I now found myself subtly ostracized from a like reason, until I convinced the peasants how little I knew of my heritage. Even then they sullenly disliked me, so that I had to collect most of the village traditions through the mediations of Norris. What the people could not forgive, perhaps, was that I had come to restore a symbol so abhorrent to them. For, rationally or not, they viewed the Exon Priory as nothing less than a haunt of fiends and werewolves. Piecing together the tales which Norris collected for me, and supplementing them with the accounts of several savants who had studied the ruins, I deduced that Exon Priory stood on the site of a prehistoric temple, a druidical or anti-druidical thing, which must have been contemporary with the Stonehenge. The indescribable rites had been celebrated there. Few doubted, and there were unpleasant tales of the transference of these rites into the Sibyl worship which the Romans had introduced. Sibyl worship, inscriptions still visible in the subcellar bore such unmistakable letters as Div Ops Magna Mat, sign of the Magna Mater, whose dark worship was once vainly forbidden to Roman citizens. Ancaster had been the camp of the 3rd Augustan Legion, as many remains attest, and was said that the temple of Cybele was splendid and thronged with worshippers who performed nameless ceremonies at the bidding of a Phrygian priest. Tales added that the fall of the old legion did not end the orgies at the temple, but that the priests lived on in a new faith, without real change. Likewise was it said that the rites did not vanish with the Roman power, and that certain among the Saxons added to what remained of the temple, and gave it the essential outline it subsequent preserved, making it the center of a cult feared through half the heptarchy. About AD 1000, the place is mentioned in a chronicle as being a substantial stone priory housing a strange, powerful monastic order, and surrounded by extensive gardens which needed no walls to exclude a frightened populace. It was never destroyed by the Danes, though after the Norman conquest it must have declined tremendously, since there was no impediment when Henry III granted the site to my ancestor, Gilbert Delapour, 1st Baron Exham, in 1261. Of my family of my family before this date there is no evil report. But something strange must have happened then. In one chronicle there is a reference to a Delapour as cursed of God in 1307, whilst village legendary had nothing but evil and frantic fear to tell of the castle that went up on the foundations of the old temple and priory. The fireside tales were of the most grisly description, all the ghastlier because of their frightening reticence and cloudy evasiveness. They represented my ancestors as a race of hereditary demons, beside whom Gilles de Retz and Marquis de Sade, who seem the veriest heroes, and hinted whisperingly at their responsibility for the occasional disappearances of villagers through several generations. The worst characters, apparently, were the barons and the direct heirs. At least, most was whispered about these. If of healthier inclinations, it was said, an heir would early and mysteriously die to make way for another more typical scion. There seemed to be an inner cult in the family, presided over by the head of the house, and sometimes closed except to a few members. Temperament rather than ancestry was evidently the basis of the cult, for it was entered by several who married into the family. Lady Margaret Trevor, from Cornwall, wife of Godfrey, the second son of the 5th Baron, became a favorite bane of children all over the countryside, and the demon heroine of a particularly horrible old ballad, not yet extinct near the Welsh border. Preserved in balladry too, though not illustrating the same point, is the hideous tale of Lady Mary de la Poer, who shortly after her marriage to the Earl of Shrewsfield was killed by him and his mother, both of the slayers being absolved and blessed by the priest, to whom they confessed what they dared not repeat to the world. These myths and ballads, typical as they were of crude superstition, repelled me greatly. Their persistence and their application to so long a line of my ancestors were especially annoying, whilst the imputations of monstrous habits proved unpleasantly reminiscent of the known scandal of my immediate forebears. The case of my cousin, young Randolph Delapour of Carfax, who went among the Negroes and became a voodoo priest after he returned from the Mexican War. I was much less disturbed by the vaguer tales of wails and howlings in the barren, windswept valley beneath the limestone cliff, of the graveyard stenches after the spring rains, of the floundering, squealing white thing on which Sir John Clave's horse had trod one night in a lonely field, and of the servant who had gone mad at what he saw in the priory in the full light of day. These things were hackneyed spectral lore, and I was at that time a pronounced skeptic. The accounts of vanished peasants were less to be dismissed, though not especially significant in view of medieval custom. Prying curiosity meant death, and more than one severed head had been publicly shown on the bastions, now effaced around Exham Priory. A few of the tales were exceedingly picturesque, and made me wish I had learned more of the comparative and mythology in my youth. There was, for instance, the belief that a legion of back-twinned devils kept witches' Sabbath each night at the priory, a legion whose sustenance might explain the disproportionate abundance of coarse vegetables harvested in the vast gardens, and most vivid of all, there was the dramatic epic of the rats, the scampering army of obscene vermin which had burst forth from the castle 3 months after the tragedy had doomed it to desertion. The lean, filthy, ravenous army which had swept all before it, and devoured fowl, cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, and even 2 hapless human beings, before its fury was spent. Around that unforgettable rodent army, a whole separate cycle of myths revolves, for it scattered among the village homes and brought curses and horrors in its train. Such was the lore that assailed me as I pushed to completion, with an elderly obstinance, obstinacy, the work of restoring my ancestral home. It must not be imagined for a moment that these tales formed my principal psychological environment. On the other hand, I was constantly praised and encouraged by Captain Norris and the antiquarians who surrounded and aided me. When the task was done, over 2 years after its commencement, I viewed the great rooms, wainscoted walls, vaulted ceilings, mullioned windows, and broad staircases with a pride which fully compensated for the prodigious expense of the restoration. Every attribute of the Middle Ages was cunningly reproduced, and the new parts blended perfectly with the original walls and foundations. The seed of my fathers was complete, and I looked forward to redeeming at last the local fame of the line which ended in me. I would reside here permanently, and prove that a Delapour, for I had adopted again the original spelling of the name. It's spelled differently because the Americans changed their spelling, I guess. For I had adopted again the original spelling of the name. Need not be a fiend. My comfort was perhaps augmented by the fact that, although Exham Priory was medievally fitted, its interior was in truth wholly new and free from old vermin and old ghosts alike. As I have said, I moved in on July 16th, 1923. My household consisted of 7 servants and 9 cats, of which latter species I am particularly fond. My eldest cat, Niggerman, was 7 years old, and had come with me from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. The others I had accumulated whilst living with Captain Norris's family during the restoration of the priory. For 5 days our routine proceeded with the utmost placidity, my time being spent mostly in the codification of old family data. I had now obtained some very circumstantial accounts of the final tragedy and flight of Walter Delapour, which I conceived to be the probable contents of the hereditary paper lost in the fire at Carfax. It appeared that my ancestor was accused, with much reason, of having killed all the other members of his household, except 4 servants confederates, in their sleep about 2 weeks after a shocking discovery which changed his whole demeanor, but which, except by implication, he disclosed to no one save perhaps the servants who assisted him and afterward fled beyond reach. This deliberate slaughter, which included a father, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, was largely condoned by the villagers, and so slackly treated by the law that its perpetrator escaped honored, unharmed, and undistinguished to Virginia. The general whispered sentiment being that he had purged the land of immemorial curse. What discovery had prompted an act so terrible I could scarcely even conjecture. Walter Delapour must have known for years the sinister tales about his family, so that this material could have given him no fresh impulse. Had he then witnessed some appalling ancient rite, or stumbled upon some frightful and revealing symbol in the priory or its vicinity? He was reputed to have been a shy, gentle youth in England. In Virginia he seemed not so much hard or bitter as harassed and apprehensive. He was spoken of in the diary of another gentleman adventurer, Francis Harley of Bellevue, as a man of unexampled justice, honor, and delicacy. On July 22nd occurred the first incident, which, though lightly dismissed at the time, takes on a preternatural significance in relation to later events. It was so simple as to be almost negligible, and could not possibly have been so noticed under the circumstances, for it must be recalled that since I was in a building particularly fresh and new except for the walls, and surrounded by a well-balanced staff of servitors, Apprehension would have been absurd despite the locality. What I afterwards remembered is merely this, that my old black cat, whose moods I know so well, was undoubtedly alert and anxious to an extent wholly out of keeping with his natural character. He roved from room to room, restless and disturbed, and sniffed constantly about the walls, which formed part of the Gothic structure. I realized how trite this sounds, like the inevitable dog in the ghost story, which always growls before his master sees the sheeted figure. Yet I cannot consistently suppress it. The following day a servant complained of restlessness among all the cats in the house. He came to me in my study, a lofty west room on the second story, with groined arches, black oak panelling, and triple Gothic windows, overlooking a limestone cliff and desolate valley. And even as he spoke, I saw the jetty form of Niggerman creeping along the west wall and scratching at the new panels which overlaid the ancient stone. I told the man that there must be some singular odor or emanation from the old stonework, imperceptible to human senses, but affecting the delicate organs of cats, even through the new woodwork. This I truly believed, and when the fellow suggested the presence of mice or rats, I mentioned that there had been no rats there for 300 years, and that even the field mice of the surrounding country could hardly be found in these high walls, where they had never been known to stray. That afternoon I called on Captain Norris, and he assured me that it would be quite incredible for field mice to infest the priory in such a sudden and unprecedented fashion. That night, dispensing as usual with a valet, I retired in the west tower chamber, which I had chosen as my own, reached from the study by a stone staircase and short galley, the former partly ancient, the latter entirely restored. This room was a circular, very high and without wainscoting being, hung with arras which I had myself chosen in London. Seeing that Niggerman was with me, I shut the heavy Gothic door, and retired by the light of the electric bulbs which so cleverly counterfeited candles. Finally switching off the light and sinking on the carved and canopied four-poster, with the venerable cat in his accustomed place across my feet. I did not draw the curtains, but gazed out at the narrow north window which I faced. There was a suspicious aurora in the sky, and the delicate traceries of the window were pleasantly silhouetted. At some time I must have fallen quietly asleep, for I recall a distant sense of leaving strange dreams, when the cat started violently from his placid position. I saw him in the faint auroral glow, head strained forward, 4 feet on my ankles, and hind feet stretched behind. He was looking intensely at a point on the wall somewhat west of the window, a point which to my eye had nothing to mark it, but towards which all my attention was now directed. And as I watched, I knew that Niggerman was not vainly excited. Whether the arras actually moved, I cannot say. I think it did, very slightly, but what I can swear to is that behind it I heard a low, distant scurrying as of rats or mice. In a moment the cat had jumped bodily on the screening tapestry, bringing the affected section to the floor with his weight, and exposing a damp ancient wall of stone, patched here and there by the restorers, and devoid of any trace of rodent prowlers. Niggerman had raced up and down the floor by this part of the wall, clawing the fallen arras, and seemingly trying at times to insert a paw between the wall and the oaken floor. He found nothing, and after a time returned wearily to his place across my feet. I had not moved, but I did not sleep again that night. In the morning I questioned all the servants, and found that none of them had noticed anything unusual, save the cook remembered the actions of a cat which had rested on her window-sill, This cat had howled at some unknown hour of the night, awaking the cook in time for her to see him dart purposefully out of the open door, down the stairs. I drowsed away the noontime, and in the afternoon called again on Captain Norris, who became exceedingly interested in what I told him. The odd incidents, so slight yet so curious, appealed to his sense of the picturesque, and elicited from him a number of reminiscences of local ghostly lore. We were genuinely perplexed at the presence of rats, and Norris lent me some traps and Paris green, which I had the servants place in strategic locations when I returned. I retired early, being very sleepy, but was harassed by dreams of the most horrible sort. I seemed to be looking down from an immense height upon a twilight grotto, knee-deep with filth, where a white-bearded demon, swineherd, drove about with his staff a flock of fungus, flappy beasts, whose appearance filled me with unutterable loathing. Then, as the swineherd paused and nodded over his desk, a mighty swarm of bats rained down on the stinking abyss and fell to devouring beasts and man alike. From this terrific vision, I was abruptly awakened by the motion of Niggerman, who had been sleeping as usual across my feet. This time I did not have to question the source of his snarls and hisses, and of the fear which made him sink his claws into my ankle, unconscious of their effect, for on every side of the chamber walls were alive with nauseous sound. The verminous slivering of ravenous gigantic rats. There was now no aurora to show the state of the arras, the fallen section of which had been replaced, but I was not too frightened to switch on the light. As the bulbs leapt into radiance, I saw a hideous shaking all over the tapestry, causing the somewhat peculiar designs to execute a singular dance of death. This motion disappeared almost at once, and the sound within it, springing out of bed, I poked at the arras with the long handle of a warming pan that rested near, and lifted one section to see what lay beneath. There was nothing but the patched stone wall, and even the cat had lost his tense realization of abnormal presences. When I examined the circular trap that had been placed in the room, I found all of the openings sprung, though no trace remained of what had been caught and had escaped. Further sleep was out of the question, so, lighting a candle, I opened the door and went out in the gallery towards the stairs to my study, Niggerman following at my heels. Before we had reached the stone steps, however, the cat darted ahead of me and vanished down the ancient flight. As I descended the stairs myself, I became suddenly aware of sounds in the great room below, sounds of a nature which could not be mistaken. The oak-paneled walls were alive with rats, scampering and milling whilst Niggerman was racing about with the fury of a baffled hunter. Reaching the bottom, I switched on the light, which did not this time cause the noise to subside. The rats continued their riot, stampeding with such force and distinctness that I could finally assign to their motions a definite direction. These creatures, in numbers apparently inexhaustible, were engaged in one stupendous migration from inconceivable heights to some depth conceivably or inconceivably below. I now heard steps in the corridor, and in another moment 2 servants pushed open a massive door. They were searching the house for some unknown source of disturbance which had thrown all the cats into a snarling panic and caused them to plunge precipitately down several flights of stairs and squat yowling before the closed door to the sub-cellar. I asked them if they had heard the rats, but they replied in the negative, and when I turned to call their attention to the sounds in the panels, I realized that the noise had ceased. With the 2 men, I went down to the door of the sub-cellar, but found that cats already dispersed. Later I resolved to explore the crypt below, but for the present I merely made a round of the traps. All was sprung, yet all were tenantless. Satisfying myself that no one had heard the rats save the felines and me, I sat in my study till morning, thinking profoundly and recalling every scrap of legend I had unearthed concerning the building I inhabited. I slept some in the forenoon, leaning back in the one comfortable library chair which my medieval plan of furnishing could not banish. Later I telephoned to Captain Norris, who came over and helped me explore the subcellar. Absolutely nothing untoward was found, although we could not repress a thrill at the knowledge that this vault was built by Roman hands. Every low arch and massive pillar was Roman, not the debased Romanesque of the bungling Saxons, but the severe and harmonious classicism of the age of the Caesars. Indeed, the walls abounded with the inscriptions familiar to the antiquarians who had repeatedly explored the place. Things like Pgetea prop temp dona le... Yeah, it's just a bunch of gibberish, basically. The reference to Etis made me shiver, for I had read Catullus and knew something of the hideous rites of the Eastern god, whose worship was so mixed with that of Cybele. Norris and I, by the light of lanterns, tried to interpret the odd and nearly effaced design on certain irregularly rectangular blocks of stone generally held to be altars, but could make nothing of them. We remember that one pattern, a sort of raised sun, was held by students to imply a non-Roman origin, suggesting that these altars had merely been adopted by the Roman priests from some older and perhaps aboriginal temple on the same site. On one of these blocks were some brown stains which made me wonder. The largest in the center of the room had certain features on the upper surface which indicated its connection with fire, probably burnt offerings. Such were the sights in that crypt before whose door the cats yowled, and where Norris and I now determined to pass the night. Couches were brought down by the servants, who were told not to mind any nocturnal actions of the cats, and Nigger Man was admitted as much for help as for companionship. We decided to keep the great oak door, a modern replica with slits for ventilation, tightly closed, and with this attended to, we retired with lanterns still burning to await whatever might occur. The vault was very deep in the foundation of the priory, and undoubtedly far down on the face of the beetling limestone cliff overlooking the waste valley. That it had been the goal of the scuffling and unexplainable rats, I could not doubt, though why I could not tell. As we lay there expectantly, I found my vigil occasionally mixed with half-formed dreams, from which the uneasy motions of the cat across my feet would arouse me. These dreams were not wholesome, but horribly like the one I had had the night before. I saw again the twilight grotto, and the swineherd with his unmentionable fungus beasts, wallowing in filth, and as I looked at these things they seemed nearer and more distinct, so distinct that I could almost observe their features. Then I did observe the flabby features of one of them, and awakened with such a scream that Nigger Man started up, whilst Captain Norris, who had not slept, laughed considerably. Norris might have laughed more, or perhaps less, had he known what it was that had made me scream, but I did not remember myself till later. Ultimate horror often paralyzes memory in a merciful way. Norris waked me when the phenomena began. Out of the same frightful dream I was called by his gentle shaking and his urging to listen to the cats. Indeed, there was much to listen to, for beyond the door at the head of the stone steps was a veritable nightmare of feline yelling and clawing, whilst Nigger Man, unmindful of his kindred outside, was running excitedly round the bare stone walls, in which I heard the same babble of scurrying rats that had troubled me the night before. An acute terror now rose within me, for here were anomalies which nothing normal could well explain. These rats, if not creatures of a madness which I shared with the cats alone, must be burrowing and sliding in Roman walls I had thought to be of solid limestone blocks. Unless, perhaps, the actions of water through more than 17 centuries had eaten winding tunnels which rodent bodies had worn clean and ample. But even so, the spectral horror was no less. For if there were living vermin, why did not Norris hear their disgusting commotion? Why did he urge me to watch Nigger Man, and listen to the cats outside? And why did he guess wildly and vaguely at what could have aroused them? By the time I had managed to tell him, as rationally as I could, what I thought I was hearing, my ears gave me the last fading impression of the scurrying, which had retreated still downward, far underneath this deepest of subcellars, till it seemed as if the whole cliff below were riddled with questing rats. Norris was not as skeptical as I had anticipated, but instead seemed profoundly moved. He motioned to me to notice that the cats at the door had ceased their clamor, as if giving up the rats for lost, whilst Nigger Man had a burst of renewed relentlessness, and was clawing frantically around the bottom of the large stone altar in the center of the room, which was nearer Norris's couch than mine. My fear of the unknown was at this point very great. Something astounding had occurred, and I saw that Captain Norris, a younger and stouter, and presumably more naturally materialistic man, was affected fully as much as myself. Perhaps because of his lifelong and intimate familiarity with the local legend. We could for the moment do nothing but watch the old black cat as he pawed with decreasing fervor at the base of the altar, occasionally looking up and mewing to me in that persuasive manner which he used when he wished me to perform some favor for him. Norris now took a lantern close to the altar and examined the place where Nigger Man was pawing, silently kneeling and scraping away the lichens of the centuries which joined the massive pre-Roman block to the resellated floor. He did not find anything, and was about to abandon his efforts when I noticed a trivial circumstance which made me shudder, even though it implied nothing more than I had already imagined. I told him of it, and we both looked at it almost imperceptible manifestations with the fixedness of fascinated discovery and acknowledgement. It was only this, that the flame of the lantern set down near the altar was slightly but certainly flickering from a draught of air which it had not before received, and which came indubitably from the crevice between floor and altar, where Norris was scraping away the lichens. We spent the rest of the night in the brilliantly lighted study, nervously discussing what we should do next. The discovery that some fault deeper than the deepest known masonry of the Romans underlay this accursed pile. Some fault unsuspected by the curious antiquarians for 3 centuries would have been sufficient to excite us without any background of the sinister. As it was, the fascination became twofold, and we paused in doubt whether to abandon our search and quit the priory forever in superstitious caution, or to gratify our sense of adventure and brave whatever horrors might await us in the unknown depths. By morning, we had compromised and decided to go to London to gather a group of archaeologists and scientific men fit to cope with the mystery. It should be mentioned that before leaving the subcellar we had faintly tried to move the central altar, which we recognized as the gate to a new pit of nameless fear. What secret would open the gate? Wiser men than we would have to find. During many days, in London, Captain Norris and I presented our facts, conjectures, and legendary anecdotes to five eminent authorities, all men who could be trusted to respect any family disclosure which future explanations might develop. We found most of them little disposed to scoff, but instead intensely interested and sincerely sympathetic. It is hardly necessary to name them all, but I may say that they included Sir William Brinton, whose excavations in the drought excited most of the world in their day. As we all took the train to Ancaster, I felt myself poised on the brink of the frightful revelations, a sensation symbolized by the air of a mourning among the many Americans at the unexpected death of the president on the other side of the world. On the evening of August 7th, we reached Exham Priory, where the servants assured me that nothing unusual had occurred. The cats, even old Nigger Man, had been perfectly placid, and not a trap in the house had been sprung. We were to begin exploring on the following day, awaiting which I assigned well-appointed rooms to all my guests. I myself retired in my own tower chamber, with Nigger Man across my feet. Sleep came quickly, but hideous dreams assailed me. There was a vision of a Roman feast like that of Trimalchio, with a horror in a covered platter. Then came that damnable recurrent thing about the swineherd and his filthy drove in the twilight grotto. Yet when I awoke it was full daylight, with normal sounds, in the house below. The rats, living or spectral, had not troubled me, and Nigger Man was still quietly asleep. On going down, I found that the same tranquillity had prevailed elsewhere, a condition which one of the assembled savants, a fellow named Trunton, devoted to the psychic, rather absurdly laid to the fact that I had not now been shown the thing which certain forces wished to show me. All was now ready, and at 11 a.m. our entire group of 7 men, bearing powerful electric searchlights and implements of excavation, went down to the subcellar and bolted the door behind us. Nigger Man was with us, for the investigators found no occasion to despise his excitability, and were indeed anxious that he be present in case of obscure rodent manifestations. We noted the Roman inscriptions and unknown altar designs only briefly, for 3 of the 7 had already seen them, and all knew their characteristics. Prime attention was paid to the monumentous central altar, and within an hour Sir William Brinton had caused it to tilt backwards, balanced by some unknown species of counterweight. There now lay revealed such a horror as would have overwhelmed us had we not been prepared. Through a nearly square opening in the tilted floor, sprawling on a flight of stone steps so prodigiously worn that it was little more than an inclined plane at the center, was a ghastly array of human or semi-human bones. Those which remained their collocation as skeletons showed attitudes of panic fear, and over all were the marks of rodent gnawings. The skulls denoted nothing short of utter idiocy, cretinism, or primitive semi-apedom. Above the hellishly littered steps arced a descending passage, seemingly chiseled from the solid rock, and conducted a current of air. This current was not a sudden and noxious rush as from a closed vault, but a cool breeze, with something of freshness in it. We did not pause long, but shiveringly began to clear a passage down the steps. It was then that Sir William, examining the hewn walls, made the odd observation that the passage, according to the directions of the strokes, must have been chiseled from beneath. I must be very deliberate now and choose my words. After ploughing down a few steps amid the gnawed bones, we saw that there was a light ahead. Not any mystical phosphorescence, but a filtered daylight, which could not come, except from unknown fissures in the cliffs that overlooked the waste valley. That such fissures had escaped notice from outsiders was hardly remarkable. Not only is the valley wholly uninhabited, but the cliff is so high and beetling that only an aeronaut could study its face in detail. A few steps more, and our breaths were literally snatched from us by what we saw. So literally that Thornton, the psychic investigator, actually fainted in the arms of the dazed man who stood behind him. Norris, his plump face, utterly white and flabby, simply cried out inarticulately, whilst I think that what I did was to gasp or hiss and cover my eyes. The man behind me, the only one in the party older than I, croaked the hackneyed "My God!" in the most cracked voice I ever heard. Of 7 cultivated men, only Sir William Brinton retained his composure, a thing the more to his credit because he led the party and must have seen the sight first. It was a twilight grotto of enormous height, stretching away farther than any eye could see, a subterraneous world of limitless mystery and horrible suggestion. There were buildings and other architectural remains. In one terrified glance I saw a weird pattern of tumuli, a savage circle of monoliths, a low-domed Roman ruin, a sprawling Saxon pile, and an early English edifice of wood. But all these were dwarfed by the ghoulish spectacle presented by the general surface of the ground. For yards about the steps extended an insane tangle of human bones, or bones at least as human as those on the steps. Insane, like a foamy sea, they stretched, some fallen apart, but others wholly or partly articulated as skeletons. These latter invariably impostors of demoniacal frenzy, either fighting off some menace or clutching other forms with cannibal intent. When Dr. Trask, the anthropologist, stopped to classify the skulls, he found a degraded mixture which utterly baffled him. They were mostly lower than the piled-down man in the scale of evolution, but in every case definitely human. Many were of higher grade, and a very few were the skulls of supremely and sensitively developed types. All the bones were gnawed, most by rats, but sometimes, but somewhat by others of the half-human drove. Mixed with them were many tiny bones of rats, fallen members of the lethal army which closed the ancient epic. I wondered that any man among us had lived and kept his sanity through that hideous day of discovery. Not Hoffman or Huysmans could conceive a scene more wildly incredible, more frenetically repellent, or more gothically grotesque than the twilight grotto through which we 7 staggered, each stumbling on revelation after revelation, and trying to keep for the nonce from thinking of the events which must have taken place 300, or 1,000, or 2,000, or 10,000 years ago. It was the antechamber of hell, and poor Thornton failed again when Trask told him that some of the skeleton things must have descended as quadrupeds through the last 20 or more generations. Horror piled on horror as we began to interpret the architectural remains. The quadruped things, with their occasional recruits from the biped class, had been kept in stone pens, out of which they must have broken in their last delirium of hunger or rat fear. There had been great herds here, evidently fattened on the coarse vegetables, whose remains could be found as a sort of poisonous ensilage at the bottom of huge stone bins older than Rome. I knew now why my ancestors had had such an excessive garden. Would to heaven I could forget. The purpose of the herd I did not have to ask. So William, standing with his searchlight in the Roman ruin, translated aloud the most shocking ritual I have ever known, and told of the diet of the antediluvian cult which the priests of Cybele found and mingled with their own. Norris, used as he was to the trenches, could not walk straight when he came out of the English building. It was a butcher shop and kitchen. He expected that, but it was too much to see familiar English implements in such a place, and to read familiar English gravity there, some as recent as 1610. I could not go in that building whose demon activities were stopped only by the dagger of my ancestor Walter Delapour. What I did venture to enter was the low Saxon building whose oaken door had fallen, and there I found a terrible row of 10 stone cells, with rusty bars. 3 had tenants, all skeletons of high grade, and on the stony, bony forefinger of one I found a seal ring with my own coat of arms. Sir William found a vault with far older cells below the Roman chapel, but these cells were empty. Below them was an old low crypt with cases of formerly arranged bones, some of them bearing terrible parallel inscriptions carved in Latin, Greek, and the tongue of Phrygia. Meanwhile, Dr. Trask had opened one of the prehistoric tumuli, and brought to light skulls which were slightly more human than a gorilla's, and which bore indescribably ideographic carvings. Through all this horror, my cat stalked unperturbed. Once I saw him monstrously perched atop a mountain of bones, and wondered at the secrets that might lie behind his yellow eyes. Having grasped to some slight degree of the frightful revelations of this twilight area, an area so hideously foreshadowed by my recurrent dreams, we returned to that apparently boundless depth of midnight cavern where no ray of light from the cliff could penetrate. We shall never know what sightless Stygian worlds yawned beyond the little distance we went, for it was decided that such secrets are not good for mankind, but there was plenty to engross us close at hand, for we had not gone far before the searchlight showed that accursed infinity of pits in which the rats had feasted, and whose sudden lack of replenishment had driven the ravenous rodent army first to turn on the living herds of starving things, and then to burst forth from the priory in that historic orgy of devastation which the peasants will never forget. God! Those carrion black pits of sawed, picked bones and open skulls, those nightmare chasms choked with the pithecanthropoid, Celtic, Roman, and English bones of countless unhallowed centuries. Some of them were full, and none can say how deep they had once been. Others were still bottomless to our searchlights, and peopled by unnameable fancies. What I thought of the hapless rats that stumbled into such traps amidst the blackness of their quests in grisly Tartarus. Once my foot slipped near a horribly yawning brink, and I had a moment of ecstatic fear. I must have been musing a long time, for I could not see any of my party, but the plump Captain Norris. Then there came a sound from that inky, boundless, farther distance than I thought I knew, and I saw my old black cat dart past me like a winged Egyptian god, straight into that illuminable gulf of the unknown. But I was not far behind, for there was no doubt after another second it was the eldritch scurrying of those fiend-born rats, always questing for new horrors, and determined to lead me on even unto those grinning caverns of Earth's center, where Nyarlathotep, the mad, faceless god, howls blindly in the darkness to the piping of 2 amorphous idiot flute players. My searchlight expired, but still I ran. I heard voices and yowls and echoes, but above all there gently rose that impious, insidious scurrying, gently rising, rising, as a stiff, bloated corpse gently rising above an oily river that flows under endless onyx bridges to a black, putrid sea. Something bumped into me, something soft and plump. It must have been the rats, the vicious, gelatinous, ravenous army that feast on the dead and living. Why shouldn't rats eat a Delapour, as a Delapour eats forbidden things? The war ate my boy, damn them all, and the Yanks ate Carfax, with flames and burned Grandsire Delapour and the secret. No, no, I tell you, I am not that demon swineherd in the twilight grotto. It was not Edward Norris's fat face on that flabby fungus beast. Who says I am a Delapour? He lived, but my boy died. Shall a Norris hold the lance of a Delapour? It's voodoo, I tell you. That spotted snake, I curse you, Thornton. I'll tell you to faint at what my family do. S'blood, thou stinkard, I'll learn ye how to gust. Wolde ye schwinken me filke ways. Magna mater, magna mater. Atis, dia at achiabas at aduam. Achus bas dunach ort. Donas dozol ort achus liatsa. Ungi, ungi, rele. This is what they say I said when they found me in the blackness after 3 hours. Found me crouching in the blackness over the plump, half-eaten body of Captain Norris, with my own cat leaping and tearing at my throat. Now they have blown up Exham Priory, taken my nigger man away from me, and shut me into this barred room at Hanwell, with fearful whispers about my heredity and experience. Taunton is in the next room, where they prevent me from talking to him. They are trying to suppress most of the facts concerning the Priory. When I speak of poor Norris, they accuse me of a hideous thing, but they must know that I did not do it. They must know it was the rats, the slithering, scurrying rats, whose scampering will never let me sleep. The demon rats that raced behind the padding in this room and beckoned me down to greater horrors than I have ever known. The rats I can never hear. The rats in the walls. A good story. I kinda remember why it's a well-known story now. A lot of certain words. But I think his real-life cat was also named Niggerman, so that's why the cat's called Niggerman. And like the time it's written in, Niggerman was completely okay, so it's not worth it to really blame him for that, I guess. Like, sure, these days naming your cat Niggerman would be weird, but he's been dead for quite some time now. Which allows me to do streams about him. Or about his work, I guess. Yeah, that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. All 0 of you watching. I hope you'll be back for next time. Might be tomorrow, might not be. We'll have to see. Bye-bye.